Baking Technician for Class 9th, Unit 4, Pre-Preparation and Baking Products in the Oven, Session 2, Work Plan for Baking.
Hello students, welcome to the video lecture series for the job role Baking Technician for Class 9th, Unit 4, Pre-Preparation and Baking Products in the Oven. In the previous video, you have learned about baker's math used in baking. In this video, you will learn about work plan for baking. Before actual baking, certain pre-preparations like cleaning the workplace, measuring ingredients, preheating the oven, etc. are carried out. The pre-preparation activities undertaken before, during and after the production stage are collectively called a work plan. A work plan includes the name of the specific product to be made, formulating its recipe, listing the required ingredient, tools and equipment, and organizing the workspace. Depending upon the kind of the kitchen, that is domestic, commercial or factory kitchen, where the baking is being carried out, the following pre-preparatory activities are conducted to achieve the final product. First is the pre-production sequence, second is the production sequence, and third is the post-production sequence. The pre-production sequence involves defining the product, listing the required tools and equipment, creating a recipe sheet, organizing the workspace. The production sequence involves mixing and kneading, resting and proofing, and baking. The post-production sequence involves cooling and storing. Let us now understand these sequences in detail. First is pre-production sequence, in which the first is defining the product. A product is defined through a document called menu. A menu contains information about the various products for sale by bakery. Defining a product in a menu is based on the following parameters of the product. What do you want to make? Its size or weight, its appearance, its packaging. Next is listing the required tools and equipment. After defining the product, various tools and equipments are arranged to make the product. For example, some of the tools and equipment required to make a vanilla cookies involves the following. And tools include baking tray, scraper and spatula, knife and square cookie cutter, while under equipment it includes planetary mixture, weighing scales, oven and cooking rack. Next is creating a recipe sheet. A recipe sheet is a written document of the ingredient and method to prepare the particular product with uniformity. The recipe sheet differs from product to product. After defining the product and listing the tools and equipment, the recipe sheet is prepared listing all the ingredients, their quantities, baking time, baking temperature, weight of the raw and finished product, its portion size, its photograph, and the method followed to achieve the desired product. A recipe is generally finalized after a series of trials, and once the desired result is obtained, the recipe is standardized and is not changed without the approval of a concerned authority. Let us understand more about the recipe sheet through this illustration. Now, in this illustration, you can see a typical recipe sheet related to the preparation of white bread. A recipe sheet clearly shows the amount of ingredient and the steps required to be followed by the technician so as to bake the product as per the requirement. The recipe sheet is created with a lot of repeated trials and necessary changes so as to achieve the desired results. Next is organizing the workspace. After creating the recipe sheet, ingredient list and equipment list, a baker is ready to organize raw material that is needed for production of the products. The baker must organize storage containers, storage shelves, and space so as to accommodate all the raw material. It is necessary to clean and sanitize the work table, baking tools and equipment, and place them at respective areas. This helps the bakers to ascertain the safe production practice, which leads to efficiency in the work. Procure all the raw materials from the main storeroom or the market and store them in respective containers for daily use. Once the baker has all the ingredients at their disposal, they then go to the next stage of weighing all the ingredients mentioned in the recipe sheet. Next is weighing and scaling a recipe. Once all the ingredient containers are organized, the baker goes through the recipe sheet and starts measuring the ingredient in the recipe to produce a certain number of pieces of a product. Depending upon the need, they can scale the recipe in higher or lower doses. Next is setting up oven temperature. Once the recipe is measured or scaled and measured, the baker turns on his oven and sets the required temperature to preheat the oven before actual manufacturing of the product starts. Production sequence. This involves first is mixing and kneading. After measuring all the ingredients, they must be put into the respective machinery for processing. Depending upon the instruction in the recipe, the ingredients are either creamed, mixed, kneaded, or whipped, etc. Follow instructions in the recipe carefully to avoid spoiling the finished product. Next is resting and proofing. Once the mixture is mixed or kneaded, it goes into the next step of resting. In case of cookie, cracker, tea cake, etc. Or resting and proofing both in case of breads. Next is baking. Once the resting and proofing process is completed, the product is then either shaped or directly prepared for baking into the oven. Recheck the temperature and put the product into the oven for baking. Post-production sequence. This involves cooling and storing. Once the product is baked, it is allowed to cool, and after cooling, it is packed and stored as per the storage policy. Let us now understand some important process used in baking. First is shortening process. The process of shortening is used in bread dough and flaky pastry dough preparation. Shortening is a process of adding edible fats, also called as shortening agents like oil, butter or margarine, etc., while preparing the dough before baking the product. The type and quantity of shortening agent to be used varies from product to product. Next is creaming process. The technique of softening the shortening agents like solid fat or butter into a smooth mass and blending them with other ingredients like sugar, flour, etc. is called creaming. During the creaming process, air is entrapped into the shortening agent, which expands when heated during the baking process. The overall impact of creaming is that it gives the volume to the bakery product. The technique is most often used in making cake batter, cookie dough, buttercream, etc. Next is leavening process. Leavening process raises and increases volume in bakery products like cakes, breads, cookies, etc. It gives shape and adds texture to the product. Different chemical leavening agents are baking soda, ammonium bicarbonate, baking powder. Chemical leavening agents are used in cakes, sponges, cookies, muffins, etc. Biological leavening agents, when added to dough, initiate fermentation by acting upon sugars present in ingredients of the dough. Different biological leavening agents are baker's yeast, sourdough, whipping process. The process of beating an ingredient vigorously so that air can be incorporated into it, which in turn makes it frothy or foamy, is called whipping. It is done with the help of a wire whisk, by hand or by machine. For example, when egg whites are beaten, they become fluffy and foamy because of the trapped air in it. The air incorporated during the whipping of eggs expands when the batter is baked and causes cake to rise. Sponge cake is an example of cakes leavened by whipping. Whipping cream doubles or triples in its volume in the whipping process. Next is mixing process. Mixing or blending is the process of combining more than one ingredient together. It is of two types. First is dry mixing. Dry mixing takes place by combining more than one dry ingredient together, like mixing flour, cocoa powder and baking powder together with the help of a sieve or spatula. Wet mixing. Wet mixing takes place by combining dry ingredients like flour, sugar powder are mixed into wet ingredients like butter and eggs, or vice versa, or combining more than one wet ingredient together with the help of a whisk or spatula. Next is kneading process. Kneading is the process used in leavened and unleavened dough making. Dry ingredients such as flour are mixed with liquid ingredients like milk, water, eggs, etc. with the help of hand or machine to develop gluten in the dough, which adds strength to the final product. Students, kneading can be seen during the preparation of chapati dough, naan dough, bread dough, puff dough, etc. Next is fermentation. Fermentation is the process in which yeast in the dough feeds upon the sugar present in the ingredients in the dough and releases carbon dioxide and other gases, leading to the rise of the dough. It is done in bread dough. Next is baking process. Baking is the final step where the proof dough is placed in the preheated oven at a certain temperature for a certain time. While baking, the dough further gains the volume, texture, structure, shape and color. Once it is completely cooked, it is removed from the oven and allowed to cool. It can be consumed immediately or stored for later usage. So students, let us summarize what we have learned in this session. A work plan includes the name of the specific product to be made, formulating its recipe, listing the required ingredient, tools and equipment, and organizing the workspace. Depending upon the kind of the kitchen where baking is being carried out, the following pre-preparatory activities are conducted to achieve the final product. First is pre-production sequence, second is production sequence, and third is post-production sequence. Pre-production sequence involves defining the product, listing the required tools and equipment, creating a recipe sheet, organizing the workspace. Production sequence involves mixing and kneading, resting and proofing, and baking. Post-production sequence involves cooking and storing. The processes involved in baking a product are shortening process. Second is the leavening process. Third is the creaming process. Fourth is whipping process. Fifth is mixing process. Sixth is kneading process. Seventh is fermentation. And the last is the baking process. So students, that is all from this session. Till then, keep watching and enjoy learning. Thank you.